Hey everyone, Kibler here, and I wanted to bring you my thoughts on the very swiftly revealed Deadmines Mini-Set. First of all, though, I do want to let you all know I am going to be moving. In fact, I actually have movers here right now as I'm recording this. I am moving the day the Mini-Set releases on November 2nd, which is likely the day that you're going to be watching this. So unfortunately, there is the distinct possibility that I will be delayed in getting new content to you all. So I apologize for that. I will do my best to get my internet and everything up and running at my new place as quickly as possible. But I wanted to be able to share my thoughts about these cards with you now, since it may be a bit before I get a chance to play with them and share that all with you. So let's jump right in with our very first card, which is Proving Grounds. The 6-cost Demon Hunter card. Summon 2 minions from your deck, they fight. This is a very weird card. It can be very, very powerful with the right context. Say you had 2 strong Death Rattle minions that kill each other in, say, Burning Blade Acolytes, right? They kill each other, boom, you pay 6 mana, you get 2 5/8 taunts. That's insanely powerful, right? So this is a very interesting card to try to build your deck around. It does feel like Death Rattle is pretty much intrinsically the sort of thing that you want to be doing with this, or maybe just very low attack, very high health minions that have some sort of effect when they're in play, or just, are very, very powerful just sitting there, right? Like old Ysera, not the Battlecry Ysera, but the old Ysera would be a really powerful thing to put into play with Proving Grounds alongside, say, a Death Rattle minion that Ysera kills and gets you a body. That is the sort of thing that I feel like you want to have your eyes on looking through, deck building. Death Rattle stuff, big passive effects, or again, just low attack, very high health, maybe big taunt minions. So like an Alley Armor Smith. I can't really think of stuff outside of like Burning Blade Acolyte that really jumps out at me as like, oh my god, this is amazing right now. That does exist in Demon Hunter. And there is the weirdness that you don't want to have just like a deck where this is frequently going to be bad. You want to be very heavily indexed on powerful Death Rattles specifically, rather than just powerful Death Rattle minions. Something like a Fell Rattler, right, is not a particularly good thing to Proving Grounds into. Or even the guys who, when they die, put a thing from your hand into play, because you're just paying 6 to put some things from your hand into play, probably cost around 6 or 7, and you're losing the card from your hand and then those other cards from your hand. So definitely a card to keep an eye on, because I do think it has potential, but I don't know that there's necessarily enough real support for it just yet. Next up, we have the Need for Greed. 5-cost spell, tradable, draw 3 cards. If drawn this turn, this costs 3. This could be a powerful addition to the Quest Demon Hunter decks that are looking to obviously just keep drawing through a bunch of cards in their deck. They have a lot of incremental ways to draw cards like other tradable cards that can make it more likely this is the particular card you drew in a turn, and you can spend your 3 rather than 5 on this. And obviously just to draw up your hand. The fact that it is itself tradable obviously just synergizes extremely well with that style of deck already, because you want those incremental card draw effects for cheap. I don't know that this is likely to see much play like elsewhere. Maybe you could use this as a card draw tool in a deck like, say, Big Demon Hunter or something like that, that doesn't really effectively use Skull of Gul'dan. One of the big issues with Skull of Gul'dan is the outcast requirement for it to be very powerful essentially necessitates that you be playing a deck with a significant amount of cheap stuff that you can shift around in your hand. If you're playing, say, Big Demon Hunter, that's more difficult, and you don't really have access to as good card draw tools as a result. But something like this, where it's tradable in instances where maybe it's inefficient or whatnot, and can be just a easy reload, could be an effective tool for that sort of deck that doesn't have access to the more powerful card draw from Skull. Next up, we have Crow's Nest Lookout, a 3-cost 2/2 demon. Battlecry, deal 2 damage to the left and rightmost enemy minions. It is a demon, which incidentally is I think actually weirdly not good for Demon Hunter, because maybe this would be a tool if it weren't a demon that you could play as like a removal effect in the big demon decks that are looking for that style of just like early to mid game removal for small minions. But because it is a demon, it disrupts stuff like Pit Commander. And that ends up being kind of a drawback for that style of deck. There's already just a lot of good anti-minion stuff in Demon Hunter. Maybe this is like something you play in like an aggro Demon Hunter deck that doesn't want to play something like Immolation Aura, or Fell Barrage, and this is something that weirdly your opponent might feel like they need to like play around. It's not like a outcast thing, so it's unlikely to come off of, to just show up in games, because I don't really think this is a card that people are super likely to put into their decks. So you'll just be frustrated when you don't play around it and your opponent randomly has it. All right, next up we have Druid in Moonlit Guidance, a 2-cost arcane spell. Discover a copy of a card in your deck. If you play it this turn, draw the original. The flexibility of this is pretty interesting. It is sort of like a draw 2, because you get the the effect immediately. You already have like guessed the weight as a draw 2 that is very good in decks that have very high cost things. This is much better in decks that have more low cost stuff. This could, I think, potentially be a card draw effect in like a more proactive, say, like Beast Druid, Aggro Druid. I don't know if you want that sort of card draw effect, right? Like if you really have the tools for that, you already have some like composting in the existing Aggro Druid decks. But being able to effectively draw 2 for 2 in a deck that maybe has a high density of cards at the same cost, so guess the weight isn't effective, could be a very very powerful tool. Could go be used with ramp spells, with removal spells, with innervates, things like that you can pretty easily get out of your hand and cash in on the sort of bonus effect. It is a little bit weird to like Moonlit Guidance for an innervate and then play the innervate and then draw another innervate and like, okay, now I guess spent 2 to get 2 mana split across turns. I don't know. But this effect overall, it also just gives you more copies of the same effect. If you are particularly interested in, say, removal in a certain matchup, or in ramp in a certain matchup, or in card draw in a certain matchup, having access to this to be able to kind of keep the chain of the specific effects that you want going, because it does give you access to more of that type of effect rather than just raw card advantage, is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Next up, we have Druid of the Reef. 1 cost, not really a 1/1. Choose one. Either a 3/1 Shark with Rush or a 1/3 Turtle with Taunt. This is just a super powerful card on rate. A 3/1 Rush is very good for taking the board back in a lot of early game situations. 1/3 Taunt, Voidwalker saw tons of play. It's also a turtle, so it's a beast if that matters. I assume the Shark is also a beast. Well, I'm just assuming both, but they sound like beasts to me. One of the things that a deck like the Aggro Druid can often struggle with is if it falls behind, it doesn't have like exactly Park Panther. It can fall really far behind because it is just a deck that plays the board, and that's kind of it. Whereas having a 1-cost 3/1 Rush can really help you get back into it, especially with stuff like Oracle of Elune that can give you multiple copies of the 3/1 Rush to kill larger things on the opponent's side. So I think this is just a very, very, very strong card that will definitely see play in the existing Aggro Druid decks and maybe help facilitate other builds as well. Jerry Rig Carpenter. I don't really know where this name comes from. It's a little weird to me, but just sort of piecing together bits of wood. I guess that's the sort of thing that a Druid does. But anyway, it's a 2-cost 2/1 with Battlecry. Draw a choose one spell and split it. I assume this works much like the 2/3. I forget, Stellaris was it? That you played a choose one spell and gave you a copy of each half of it in your hand. This would be you draw the choose one, get each half of it in your hand, which is basically just better than drawing a choose one card from your deck because you get, again, each half of it. You don't have to choose one. You could choose both. You do have to pay for both of them. It's not like you get to nourish with the kicker, sort of as it was back in the day of Fandral. But I'm not, I do think this is a strong effect, but it's an incremental value effect, and I don't know what sort of Druid decks are necessarily like incremental value type decks. It is specifically drawing you a choose one, so if there are specific choose ones that you really want to draw, having access to more of them can be very powerful, but there's not like there is a choose one to wild growth, right? And there's no like Wrath anymore. The choose one pool is definitely a bit more limited than it was in the past. So maybe this goes in like Token Druid. It can draw you like, Power of the Wild, which each half is pretty valuable for a deck like Token Druid. And obviously being a 2-cost card that replaces itself doesn't lose you things with Glowfly Swarm, although it is a minion, so it does get discarded by Fungal Fortunes and likely doesn't really have a home in decks looking to utilize that card, which is probably more powerful than this overall. But if you think about it, this is a 2-cost card that effectively gets you a card and a half, but 2 cards in hand. So, maybe there's like a more minion-centric version of Token Druid that wants to play this and forego Fungal Fortunes instead. Definitely worth keeping in mind. Next up is Hunter. 4-drop, 3/4 Beast, Monstrous Parrot. Battlecry, repeat the last friendly death rattle that triggered. I'm apparently death rattling right now as I'm fading in and out of focus. Oh god. Okay, there I am. Haha. No death rattle for me. So I have tried building, quite a few versions of Death Rattle Hunter that have been okay. I do feel like the more aggressive versions of Hunter are probably stronger in the way that the metagame exists right now. This is a very powerful effect, though. Like if you do have, a Nerubian Egg, or you have like a Burning Blade Acolyte, getting a decent body, 4 cost 3/4 beast isn't amazing, but you get that attached to whatever the previous death rattle was, can be extremely strong. It does lead you to, much like Proving Grounds, want to have a higher density of specifically high impact death rattles that you're using, rather than just being a death rattle deck. Because if your last death rattle was like a Death's Head Cultist, it's like, okay, I don't really care that much about that. Though, again, like, depending on the matchup, maybe that's great. Maybe your Death Head Cultist dies and you gain 4 more life against an aggro deck. So I just think this is a very, very, very good card if that style of deck has the tools to be successful. And there are some other good tools in this set that I feel like can do that. So let's take a look. Next we have, not the card I was thinking of, but this is also a sweet card. Defias Blastfisher. Battlecry, deal 2 damage to a random enemy, repeat for each one of your beasts. So one thing that's interesting about this is that it offers significant direct damage, especially against AoE heavy decks, for decks that are looking to swarm. I've built a number of decks that are kind of swarm-like, whether they're rat decks or Wolpertinger copy type decks, and Defias Blastfisher in some of those decks, your opponent like wipes your board and you're like, okay, I refill with this and a Blastfisher and shoot you in the face for like 10, right? That is very, very powerful as a finisher for some of those styles of decks. It is, a card that doesn't do that much on its own outside of those contexts, so you need to be very heavily dedicated to this sort of swarm plan, whether it's, stuff like Wolpertingers and copying them, or Rat's Nest or whatever. But this is a pretty big payoff for that, and it can be board control, and it can just be a finisher. So I actually think this is a card that is probably significantly better than it looks at first. But the card that I am the most excited about from this set for Hunter, and not just because it's a dog card, Doggy Biscuit. So it's a 2-cost spell, give a minion +2/+3, which is decent already, right? If you want to like try and trade up with your small minions and your opponent's larger minions, just want to pressure more. +2/+3 is like, that's like a very, very solid buff, but also is tradable. And when you trade this, give a friendly minion rush. That is effectively like draw a card, give a minion rush, right? And that is extremely powerful for 1 cost, especially for something like a Death Rattle deck. You're very happy with sending your Burning Blade Acolyte or whatever into your opponent's minions to trigger Death Rattle immediately, and also just give you more tools for sort of getting back in the board. It's also a buff for something like a Nerubian Egg, right? So frequently you're looking for ways to trigger Death Rattles, whether immediately by rushing them in, or just because they're sitting on the board in the form of something like a Nerubian Egg, and you want to be able to pressure with them. So this card, I think, is actually probably more important for the Death Rattle Hunter style of deck than the Parrot is. And I think that we will very likely see a resurgence in that type of deck based on these 2 cards. All right, next up we have the Gray Sage Parrot. Battlecry, repeat the last spell you've cast that costs 5 or more. First of all, we've gone through a couple of these parrot cards now, and I really like the repeat kind of theme for the parrots. I think it's like a really neat, like, just pirates and parrots, parroting what you say, get it, repeating. So cool design generally. This is a neat card. One thing that I definitely struggled with when I was trying to build like big spell mage type decks, there's just not that many good big mage spells. Things that cost 5 or more in mage are pretty limited. So Gray Sage Parrot, I feel like does look like a pretty strong card, especially if you have more high cost, very powerful spells that get printed, but there aren't that many of them. There's like Deep Freeze. Flame Strike is like theoretically, good in certain matchups. Obviously, this lets you would think you'd be using this to repeat, the high quality, the powerful ones, but there just aren't that many, and they're very contextual in terms of the matchup. So I think that this probably needs more support before it's likely to see significant play. It did get some support, at least, in this set, in the form of Arcane Overflow. 5-cost spell, deal 8 to an enemy minion, summon a remnant with stats equal to excess damage. We've come so far from Flamelance, right? Flamelance was just deal 5, or deal 8 rather for 5, and this is deal 8 and make a guy. So, can be quite strong on a, whether a large minion or a small minion. And certainly a powerful card. It does say enemy minion specifically, so repeating it with a parrot does mean that you're guaranteed to hit their stuff and not randomly hit your stuff. Important thing to think about for a lot of these as well. So, maybe there's enough there, but one of the biggest concerns that I have for stuff like this, and frankly a lot of the set in general, which we'll talk about sort of at the end, there's still a lot of decks like Quest Mage and Garrett Rogue out there that are not heavily board based, and playing a bunch of expensive stuff like Overflow and Parrot to like fight for the board doesn't really seem like it's likely to be super effective against those decks. And lastly, for Mage, another card clearly aimed at this sort of big spell deck, Deepwater Evoker. 4-cost 3/4 Battlecry, draw a spell, gain armor equal to its cost. This is, clearly very strong for big spell decks. If you're looking to play a bunch of things that are, say, 5 and above, if this is 4-cost 3/4, draw a card, gain 5 armor, that's very good. It does, sort of leave you with the question, okay, well, what are you doing in order to get to that sort of stage of the game without cheap spells? Because a lot of what makes Mage good in a lot of matchups is its ability to interact early with cheap spells. Maybe you do still play some cheap spells, and Deepwater Evoker has a sort of mischance. It's not like you can't play stuff like, say, Brain Freeze or Ruined Orb in those sort of decks. You just get less value out of your Deepwater Evoker sometimes. So, but definitely, I love this. I love giving the sort of survivability to these Mage decks, as well as the sort of value that this can generate as well. So, I do think that there's a lot of tools there. I don't think there's likely to be enough yet. I'm sure I'll experiment with it, but I don't expect this sort of deck to be successful out of the gate. Next up, we have Paladin. Our first card is Righteous Defense. A 3-cost spell, set a minion's attack and health to 1. Give the stats it lost to a minion in your hand. This is a very interesting card that became more interesting with one of the reveals for the legendary cards in this set. This is a sort of effect that, like a hand buff style deck, things that can take advantage of this, like the Catacomb Guard, or the first Blade of Rin, or, as I mentioned, one of the legendary reveals, Mr. Smite. Which we will get to, but there's a lot of things in Paladin, whether they're the specific things that key off of their attack and defense, or if they are just like Divine Shield minions, right? They can get a lot of value out of this. The issue, of course, being how much are you actually draining with Righteous Defense? In a world of like a bunch of say, Gnolls and Flesh Giants, maybe this is good, but in a world of Garrett Rogue and Quest Mage, this does basically nothing. So it really sort of is very metagame dependent. There's a lot of very powerful Paladin cards. There's Righteous Defense, and then there is Wealth Redistributor, who is also great in a world of big minions. If there's a bunch of giants floating around, right, you're stealing stuff with that, and Wealth Redistributor is stealing their attack, and you're just getting all this stuff out of your opponents having big minions. The problem is, right now, in Standard, there's not many big minions. So for either of these cards to be particularly effective in the Standard metagame, we'd really need to see a significant shift in the sort of decks that are seeing play. I don't really anticipate that necessarily, based on what we're seeing here in the mini set. But it is worth keeping in mind, if we do see metagame shifts, the additional power that Paladin does have now to fight against those large minions. And lastly, for Paladin, speaking of large minions, Sunwing Squawker, a 3-cost 3/4 beast. Repeat the last spell you've cast on a friendly minion on this. This is the potential to be a very large minion. Say you just play a 1/1 that survives until turn 5, and you play Blessing of Authority on it. The next turn you play Sunwing Squawker, which gets Blessing of Authority cast on it, and then you just play an Argent Braggart. You just have a pair of gigantic minions, an 8/9, and an 8/9. And that is really good. So, maybe there's the Paladin v. Paladin world in which you have the Righteous Defenses and the Wealth Redistributors going up against the Blessing of Authority Sunwing Squawker deck. That would be the sort of ultimate self-hate Paladin metagame. But yeah, I do think this card is very powerful. Whether you're doing Blessing of Authority, Blessing of Kings, even like Hand of It All could be really good. You're paying 4 for a 5/5 that draws a card. Very, very strong. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of potential in this card. I feel like this is the Paladin card that has more potential because it is proactive. This isn't contingent on what your opponent's stuff is doing. This is something you can build your deck around to do powerfully yourself. So of the Paladin cards, this is the one that I'm most excited about, because it pushes you in a direction rather than reacting to what your opponents are doing. Next up, we have Priest, Defias Leper, a 3/2 pirate for 2. Battlecry, if you're holding a shadow spell, deal 2 damage. We've seen a real drop-off in Shadow Priest since the Elucia nerf, and a lot of the Shadow Priest decks that we did see previously were basically just a pile of minions with some raised deads, right? You really didn't have much in the way of actual shadow spells. This is a powerful enough card, I think, that it may lead people to build Shadow Priest differently with a heavier emphasis on shadow spells. Because just a 3/2 for 2 that just deals 2 as a battle cry, whether it's your opponent or for a minion, exceptionally powerful both for tempo, aggro, board control, whatever. So I am curious to see if we do see a resurgence in Shadow Priest as a result of this, and perhaps a bit of a differentiation in terms of the specific ways the decks are constructed. Next up is Copycat. This is one of my favorite cards in the set just because I think it's pretty cool. I don't know if it's necessarily that good, but 3 cost 3/4 Battlecry, add a copy of the next card your opponent plays to your hand. So this is sort of card advantage, right? But your opponent has some amount of control over what you actually get from it. At the same time, it can be very disruptive to your opponent. Playing against like Ramp Druid, right? You play Copycat on 3, and they're like, well, I wanted to Overgrowth on 4, but then I give you an Overgrowth, and I don't really get a mana advantage. They probably still want to do it because it's kind of essential for their deck to operate that way. You know, and based on the wording of this, it's not like add a copy of the next card your opponent plays next turn. They can't just like sit and wait a turn. They have to like play something. Maybe they give you, you know, like a Nature Studies. Maybe they give you an Innervate. But all of these are like kind of disrupting their game plan and costing them something and giving you something. So I think this is one of the more interesting cards in this set, just in terms of the dynamic it creates around how you know, players are going to be, you know, sort of interacting and throwing their opponent off of their game plan. So super cool card, and I'm definitely looking forward to experimenting with it. Next up, we have Amulet of Undying. 3 cost shadow spell, tradable. Shadow, potentially important, as we've, you know, discussed the possible shadow build. Resurrect a friendly death rattle minion, upgrades when traded. So 3 cost to resurrect a specific type of minion is actually reasonable to begin with. Tradable is obviously like a benefit in itself, and then the upgrade when traded. I keep sort of fading when I talk about death rattles. This is a little scary. Resurrect a friendly death rattle minion, upgrade when traded. Being able to upgrade this to 2 or 3 over the course of a long game can be extremely powerful. And it's interesting because it is specifically death rattle minions, so you could just play, say, particularly high impact death rattle minions along the lines of Light Shower Elemental, and be sort of guaranteed to get pretty powerful stuff back from this. And unlike a lot of cards that are this theoretically narrow, because it is tradable, if you can play this with just bigger death rattle minions and just trade it in, right? When you don't have those death rattle minions. In the early game, this is pay 1, draw a card, put it back into your deck and upgrade it. And you get to the point where you have your Light Shower Elementals or Cairns or whatever else, your Moarg Forge Fiends that, have died, and now suddenly you're like, okay, Amulet of Dying for 4, right? Get a huge board back of really, really powerful things. So I think this is a very interesting card, sort of define the direction of some archetypes. I am, of course, as I mentioned throughout this, concerned about the viability of anything like this in a world of Quest Mages and Garrett Rogues. But I do think this is a very cool card that has significant build-around potential if the metagame isn't too oppressive toward that style of deck. All right, next up we have Rogue with the Blackwater Cutlass. A 1-cost 2/2 weapon, tradable. After you trade this, reduce the cost of a spell in your hand by 1. First of all, this is just a 1-cost 2/2 weapon. That's just pretty good, right? Obviously, Rogue has a lot of things that utilize weapons, and it has a variety of ways to kind of get these seemingly endless weapons, but just a 1-cost 2/2 weapon is just a very, very efficient card. I don't know that we've seen a 1-cost 2/2 weapon previously that didn't have some form of drawback, at least. So that alone is an interesting thing here. And then tradable. After you trade this, reduce the cost of a spell in your hand by 1. So I heard some people saying, oh, this is just another card for Garrett Rogue. And I'm like, well, it only affects 1 card. And despite being tradable, it doesn't actually net you more cards itself. I don't really feel like that's very likely. I feel like this is, unless they specifically are like, okay, well, I need to fight for the board early in a way that the deck currently doesn't do, and I want to have the 1-cost 2/2 weapon as well as this possibility of trading it and reducing the cost of my spells, maybe. But But this, I mean, it is like just, you spend one and you're basically banking that mana for later because it reduces the cost of one of the spells in your hand, which is interesting in itself. When you think of it that way, that if you have excess mana, this just allows you to effectively bank that mana for a future turn for a spell in your hand. That is pretty interesting. But yeah, so I think this is a reasonably strong card. I don't know that it necessarily fits into the existing rogue shells, but certainly anything that allows you to long-term reduce cost of your stuff is something to keep an eye on. And next up we have Edwin Defias Kingpin. You can't keep a good pirate down. 4-cost 4/4 battlecry, draw a card. If you play it this turn, gain +2/+2 and repeat this effect. So I like the fact that they kind of went to back to Edwin as, hey, this is this guy who can grow enormously. This time he is more of a card advantage tool than just a gigantic thing you can play early on. Growing for, kind of reverse combo, right? Like you play this and then for every card you draw and play off of him, boom, gets bigger. And you can have a lot of rogue decks that have a lot of really cheap stuff, as we have seen. I don't know that this is something that necessarily goes into, say, Garrett Rogue, because Garrett Rogue specifically, wants to be very, very lean, and lots of its cards are very situational, so wanting to power up Edwin by playing those, not necessarily great. But it is just bare minimum 4-cost 4/4 draw card, right? Bare minimum, and that's good. So maybe you do end up seeing play like that. It can just kind of be this alternate threat. It does conflict specifically with Kazakis, which sees play in a significant number of those decks. So that is certainly something to keep in mind as a potential barrier to this seeing that much play, at least in the existing builds of Rogue. But I do think this is a very very cool card and has potential for maybe non-combo-ish, combo in the sense of the deck archetype, not the mechanic versions of Rogue. Maybe this sees play in, say, the Quest Rogue decks, right? You have a lot of cheap stuff in the form of like extortions and whatever else, and it's just a solid minion that draws you cards. So certainly strong. Don't know if it necessarily has a home in the decks that exist right now. And lastly for Rogue we have Parlay. 1-cost spell, swap this for a card in your opponent's deck. So this can be used theoretically like against, say, a combo deck, right? Against a combo deck, maybe you play your Parlay, steal a key card from their deck. They do get the Parlay back, and they can steal cards from your deck, but they can't get the card that you stole from their hand. It's a weird card. I feel like we see a lot of like anti-combo-ish Rogue cards. Like there's like this, there's like Deviate, and it's like, well, Rogue is one of the decks that can just kill your opponent if they're playing a combo deck. So having like these incremental like mess with your combo things aren't really necessarily that valuable. Maybe this is something that you have a Thief Rogue style deck that's interested in this. Maybe there's some way to like make more of these. I can't really think of any way to do it, and just like steal more of your opponent's deck. Feels more like it's kind of a like meme, like steal your stuff card than anything else, and I don't really expect this to see meaningful play. Except we have Shaman, 3-cost 3/3 Brilliant Macaw, battlecry, repeat the last battlecry you played. So there's a number of things like this, like Bolner. There's now this that are kind of bonus battlecry things. I think that the biggest impact this may have is something like Wild, where you can Shudderwalk again with the Macaw. But yeah, like right now there is like a good amount of like battlecry stuff, whether in Elemental Shaman, but Elemental Shaman kind of wants elemental density. Maybe there's just really high impact battlecry stuff down the line. I don't really see this again as being something that I'm thrilled about like currently in Standard. Maybe you play like a deck with really big battlecry stuff like, I don't know, Alexstrasza or Ysera, and this can be powerful. But again, those are like really high-end things and can be difficult to really get value off the Macaw there. But certainly a powerful card. It's just a matter of like where the context is for how it actually sits in the metagame. And I'm at least so far unconvinced that it feels like it has a home right now. Next up we have Cookie the Cook, who's a 3-cost 2/3 lifesteal. With Death Rattle, equip a 2/3 Storing Rod with lifesteal. This isn't really like a card that you like build around in any meaningful way. It's a Murloc, so maybe this is a way for like a Murloc deck to have some degree of sustain. You can certainly buff Cookie with the various Murloc cards that do exist in the metagame. I don't really see this as like anything deck or metagame defining like some legendaries. It certainly isn't like a build around as much as it is just like a utility card for these most likely Murloc decks. Like maybe this is something you play in like a mid-range Shaman that just wants some lifesteal value. I don't really know, because it does this does theoretically, like if he attacks, dies, and you get the weapon, it's like 8 life, right? Because you get the weapon back. Like a 2/3 weapon with lifesteal is pretty good. There's not really ways to buff that outside of Storm Strike and Rockbiter, which aren't really cards you typically would play in like a more controlling shell. Those are typically Doomhammer cards in order to like gain more value from the lifesteal portion of the weapon. But overall, I think it's just a, he's a cool card and maybe sees play giving some sustained in Murloc decks. And next up is Sucker Hook. 4-cost 3/6 pirate. At the end of your turn, transform your weapon into one that costs 1 more. This is interesting. Like a 4-cost 3/6 is, pretty decent stats. This can essentially give you an eternal weapon, right? You have a weapon, and then you swing it, and then you let it get upgraded, and then you swing it, let it get upgraded. It does have the weird thing where say you play a weapon on 3, right? Say you play like Whack-A-Null Hammer. Then you swing it on 3, and then on 4, you can't swing it because you want to upgrade it, or maybe you can swing it because you have an extra on your hand, whatever. But I think this effect, if this stays in play for multiple turns, is extremely powerful because you just keep getting not only additional weapon charges, but likely more and more powerful weapons as it goes. I don't really know where this goes, right? If you're playing a weapon Shaman deck, it's typically a Doomhammer deck, and you're not going to get better than Doomhammer. It feels like it's a card that kind of like wants a home and doesn't really have one. As far as like where the synergies are, there's not really like weapon shaman or like kind of mid-range shaman that isn't fairly heavily influenced in a very specific direction of being like a Doomhammer deck or an Elemental deck already. Next up, Warlock cards. We have Hull Breacher, 4-cost 4/3 demon, Battlecry, and Death Rattle. Draw a card. Your hero takes damage equal to the cost, or a spell specifically, not just a card. And that is very important because that does mean that Hull Breaker can directly search up a specific spell, like say Deck of Chaos, which is something that a lot of people have like tried to make work, wanted to make work, but you'd have to just naturally draw it all the time. So you could just play Deck of Chaos and Hull Breakers and be guaranteed to, or virtually guaranteed to find your Deck of Chaos each game, and then kind of do your wacky Deck of Chaos thing. This could also just be a card that you play in, say, Quest Warlock, and that you look to lean on as just an advantage tool that helps you trigger your quest. A lot of those decks tend to have pretty cheap spells, which can be a pro and a con. A lot of those cheap things, like yes, you Hullbreaker and you don't take that much damage, but it does advance your quest, but it doesn't advance your quest that much, and you do get the spells, which obviously have value in themselves. And the fact that it's Battlecry and Death Rattle, like this is giving you multiple cards, specifically again spells that can be very high utility, and you obviously have control over like, okay, how much damage I'm actually taking because I have this range of spell costs in my deck. That is, pretty powerful card advantage wise. Not necessarily something that Warlock really struggles with. They typically are very good at building up card advantage thanks to their hero power and such. So I would imagine you'd specifically want this if you cared about the self damage or specifically hitting spells in something like Quest Warlock or Deck of Chaos. Next up is Wicked Shipment, 1-cost spell, tradable, summon 2/1/1 imps. Remember Lost in the Jungle? Lost in the Jungle was just like already pretty good, right? Make 2/1/1s. This is make 2/1/1s that upgrades. Granted, they're not Silverhand recruits, so you can't buff them in quite the same way, but Warlock has a lot of great ways to take advantage of building a wide board. I think this is very likely just a very strong card, in a Zoo-style Warlock deck. There's still stuff like Wicked Whispers available. They are imps, so they are demons, so they work very well with, say, Shady Bartender. Also, of course, being tradable, it's like you draw this, your 1-cost thing in the mid game. You're like, okay, let's find something better, and then it is better when you draw it again. So, just I think a very solid card for an aggressive Warlock strategy, which is something that we haven't really seen much of in the current metagame. It's pretty much been almost exclusively Quest Warlock that has seen play recently, and this could push you in a different direction. And next we have Shadow Blade Slinger. A 1-cost 2/1 pirate. If you've taken damage this turn, deal that much to an enemy minion. Another card that can be very, very powerful in a Zoo-style deck. A lot of Zoo decks are very tempo-oriented, and being able to, say, Flame Imp into this, or Life Tap into this, or Backfire into this, just gives you, a pretty solid tempo play in a lot of matchups. Get you back on the board against, say, Field Contact or whatever. Again, I keep repeating this, and something, again, I'm gonna follow up at the end of the video in general. This sort of card, not necessarily amazing in a metagame that is, less board focused and more sort of combo spell focused, but maybe the rest of your deck is good against that, and you're playing things like Neophytes and whatever else that help you pressure the spell-based decks, and this gives you more tools against the board-based decks. Next we have Warrior Defias Cannoneer. A 3-cost 3/3 after hero attacks, deal 2 damage to a random enemy twice. This is a very powerful effect for an after hero attacks thing. Really wants you to play weapons that cost 1. Whether you're playing like Whetstone Hatchet or Imprisoned Ganarg. This is a very big payoff when, you know, your weapon pops up on 3, or you just have the Whetstone Hatchet and you're like, okay, I swing and I do 2 damage twice. Could be a strong card just in a more aggressive Pirate Warrior deck. Right now, most of the sort of Pirate Warrior decks that we see in Standard tend to be Quest. Maybe this, you know, this could be an inclusion in the Quest decks, but those typically don't have like that many weapons they swing that quickly. Whereas, say, a deck with Whetstone Hatchet Ganarg could trigger this to do just a bunch of damage very early in the game. So this, I think, helps support the like Whetstone Hatchet Man-at-Arms type deck, which, you know, we don't really see very much currently, but I think that with this sort of card giving you the support of really, really, really wanting those early weapons for Man-at-Arms too, ends up potentially putting those over the top to where they can see play. Next up, we have Man the Cannons. 2 cost to deal 3 damage to a minion and 1 damage to all other minions. So this is sort of like a swipe. Obviously, it hits your own stuff, which for Warrior isn't necessarily a bad thing because you can shoot their thing and trigger your things that care about being damaged, like maybe a Frothing Berserker. It's a 2 cost as well, which is, you know, significantly less expensive than Swipe was. So could just be a control card, control warrior card, you know, help clear out swarms, break divine shields while killing individual minions, or again, an enabler that is removal that also buffs, you know, your stuff that cares about being damaged itself. Very good for activating like Frenzy, for instance. You know, it's not just like a Whirlwind, right? Where a Whirlwind doesn't do anything other than trigger your frenzies. This being like, hey, kill your guy, frenzy my guys, boom, or like, you know, buff my Frothing, boom, you're dead. Does have, I think, pretty significant potential. And lastly, for our class cards, we have Blacksmithing Hammer, a 4-cost 5/1 weapon. After you trade this, gain +2 durability. This is an interesting card. Just a tradable weapon, you know, means that, say, in the Quest Warrior deck, right? Maybe you want to play like your Blacksmithing Hammers. One of the issues in the Quest Warrior deck would often be like, hey, I just have too many weapons. And I draw my weapon from my quest reward first stage, and now I'm like, okay, well, I'm just weapon flooded. Be able to like trade those in and get a benefit when you redraw them later is pretty strong. Like this by itself, like a 4-cost 5/1, not very good. 4-cost 5/3, very good. That's like better than an Arcanite Reaper, right? You know, I think that's a potential home for this. Just sort of generally, you can also just like be, you know, just trying to meme up and make the biggest blacksmithing hammer possible, which is sort of appropriate given it's a blacksmithing thing. So yeah, I think this is a neat card. I don't really expect this to be like an all-star because it's not like ultra efficient initially. Just like being able to swing once with this before you've traded it is pretty bad. I do think that like just the utility of being able to like play Corsair caches and you know, draw your blacksmithing hammer and shuffle it back in rather than the Corsair cache after you have, you know, drawing your weapons being a completely dead card is actually a pretty big deal. So certainly an interesting tool for like long control games as well. If your opponent doesn't have weapon removal, you just end up with a 5-power weapon that you can swing endlessly, essentially, in a long game. And finally, we have our neutral cards. We have Goliath Sneed's Masterpiece, an 8-cost 8/8 battlecry. Fire 5 rockets at enemy minions that deal 2 damage each. You pick the targets. So rather than being just randomly everywhere, you actually get to go, okay, that takes 4, that takes 2, that takes 2, that takes 2, which is pretty awesome, right? This can be like 8-cost 8/8, kill your opponent's biggest guy, 8-cost 8/8, like clear your opponent's board. Just I think a overall very powerful card in like any kind of minion-based battle. Obviously, the fact that it can't go face does mean that it needs your opponent to have some degree of a board presence in order for it to be meaningful at all, but it's also a mech, so if you're playing like a N'Zoth or something like that, it can be, you know, a big thing that you can bring back. Obviously, you don't get the battle cry then, but yeah, just a very large neutral board control monster in the late game. Next up is Multicaster, 4-cost 3/4 battle cry. Draw a card for each different spell school you've cast this game. It's a pretty neat card. It's weird because obviously it's a minion, so you know decks like Quest Mage might not be interested in playing this because it's like, you know, okay, well, I want to have a bunch of spells in my deck because I just want to draw spells, and I have so many cards to draw cards anyway. But you know, some of them do want to play cheap minions, you know, in order to use their own frost effects. For instance, it's not being cheap, but if they're like looking for more card draw, which is not something that I think that Quest Mage generally needs, but they can get, you know, a 4-cost 3/4 draw 3 cards is kind of insane. So maybe even, despite the fact that it causes a little bit less efficiency with stuff like Incanter's Flow, it could be a powerful inclusion in some of those decks. Yeah, it's also just like, hey, this is just neutral card draw for any heavily spell-based deck as long as they kind of go in multiple spell schools. Maybe this sees play in Hunter, right? Like maybe Hunter has like, I think they have like Arcane in nature. I haven't really given it a ton of thought. Most of the classes, like maybe this sees play in Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter also has a lot of card draw to begin with, but you kind of get my point. This is a potentially strong card draw tool that's sort of a build around that a lot of different classes, because it is a neutral, any class could theoretically have access to, and that's pretty cool. It just makes you think about cards in different ways. So I would be shocked if this didn't see play, simply because it is a neutral minion that can draw multiple cards. And I think it's an interesting deck building challenge, so I'm excited to see it. Next up, we have Galaka Glutton. I love that this is the pirate getting revenge on the Galaka Crawler. 3 cost, 2/3 battlecry, destroy beast and gain +1/+1. This is a little weird to me because are beasts really like a card type that minion type that need hated on right now? I guess if you're looking for ways to like fight back against, say, like aggro druid. Specifically, this is in the same set as like the parrots, and I do think that the Paladin parrot, as I mentioned, has the potential to be extremely strong. So maybe this is a reasonable inclusion as kind of a hate card, as a preemptive answer to that. I doubt this is very likely to be like a card that sees a lot of at least initial play. It's clearly a hate card that if the metagame settles in a particular way, that there's gigantic beasts everywhere, you might want. But overall, not likely to be a all-star showing up all the time. Next we have Maddest Bomber. The cycle is complete. I hope there's a 10 cost one that's the most Maddest Bomber or something like that. But 8 cost, 9/8, deal 12 damage randomly split among all their characters. It's kind of a meme card to add more to the cycle: the Mad Bomber, the Matter Bomber, and the Maddest Bomber. So again, unlikely to really see play, but kind of a neat card to actually see come into existence. But lastly, certainly not least, we have Mr. Smite. 6 cost, 6/5, your pirates have charge. So first of all, Mr. Smite's a pirate. So bare minimum, Mr. Smite is a 6/5 charge for 6. It's not Leroy, right? Leroy was 5 cost, but had a drawback. So this could just be like, hey, I play it and it hit you, and it's just a tempo play, rather than like, okay, now you just kill him with the whelps. This also gives your other pirates charge, which makes it a pretty insane card in, say, like Quest Warrior, where you have pirates being generated every turn. This is a random pirate that can now be generated. That's one of the things that's pretty insane about a lot of the stuff in this set. There's a lot of new pirates, many of which are actually like fairly like medium to large sized, which I think dramatically changes like how powerful Raid the Docks is. Raid the Docks used to mostly give you like 2 1s, 2 3s, maybe 3 3s. There was like a 5/5 in there, but now there's like this, along with just a bunch of more medium-sized things like Edwin or whatever else. So just a lot more different stuff and a lot more powerful stuff that can come off that. So that's something that's definitely worth keeping in mind in terms of the impact on that. But yeah, Mr. Smite is, Mr. Smite created a strategy. The old Leroy meme. Obviously not, he's more expensive. But again, the fact that there's no drawback means that this isn't just a finisher. This can be a tempo card, not amazingly statted, but reasonably statted. And yeah, he can come down alongside your other pirates and end your opponent's day pretty quickly. You could theoretically play like Mr. Smite and Shadow Step or whatever with Edwin and just like kill your opponent with like a giant Edwin and Mr. Smite in one turn, because your Edwin is a pirate who will end up getting charged from this. So yeah, pretty crazy card to add. Certainly something that's powerful against the sort of board based decks that are looking to like freeze your stuff or like assemble with your stuff in hand. Having the ability to kill them from hand in more decks does give you more tools to be able to pressure stuff like Garrett Rogue and Quest Mage. That said, a lot of the stuff I talked about in this was, what I thought were cool cards that were in many cases kind of like incremental value type cards or like board presence type cards that I do think are very likely to struggle to be able to be successful in the metagame that we do have right now, with no changes to Garrett Rogue and Quest Mage, things like that. It's hard to see things like the 5 cost Mage spell deck, or Sunwing Squawker or Wealth Redistributor, or Death Rattle Shaman, or rather Hunter, or whatever else really ending up having the ability to get a foothold in what is a very, very hostile metagame to mid-range type strategies. I'm hopeful. I do think there's some cool stuff, and I would not be surprised to see balance changes coming soon, especially in the wake of the upcoming Masters Tour and coming into the next set, which weirdly enough, we are actually not that far from the next full set, most likely. Historically, we've typically seen the last set of the year happen at the beginning of December, and that's only a month away. So we'll see what impact Deadmines does have. I'm certainly excited to experiment with a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things that really do sort of support, big new archetypes that we haven't really seen before. But I do have those reservations as to how effective those archetypes will be able to be, thanks to the nature of the metagame right now. So anyway, I am, like I said, really excited to play with these cards, even if I am skeptical of a lot of their ability to be successful. Unfortunately, as I did mention, I am moving and won't necessarily have an opportunity to do so right away. But I look forward to being able to share that all with you. So thank you all very much for watching. Let me know what you think, what your favorite cards from the mini set are looking like they will be. And yeah, I will see you when I can finally get back online at my new place. So take care. I'll see you then.